Here we are as we look at the 1 Year Bible for our reading through the Bible in a year devotion, and it is July 17th, and we're looking at Romans chapter 4, 1 through 12, where Paul gives us the example of Abraham, and he is the forefather of Jewish people, but not just the Jewish people. And what did Abraham find out and live out in his life? That is spelled out in this section of Romans. So, if Abraham could be declared righteous from works, he could boast. Indeed, Jewish tradition held that Abraham was righteous because he was obedient to God and that he obeyed the law and was willing even to sacrifice Isaac before God provided another sacrifice. However, Scripture paints a rather different picture of Abraham, as Luther pointed out. If you should ask what Abraham was before he was called by a merciful God, Joshua answers that he was an idolater, that is, he deserved death and eternal damnation. This reference can be found in Joshua 24, verse 2. Furthermore, as we look at Abraham's life, he was far from perfect twice. He lied about his relationship with Sarah, his wife, and then there is the whole thing with Hagar and Ishmael, which was not very flattering for Abraham, to say the least. Yet, Abraham did have numerous good works. The key is understanding that Abraham's works followed faith. Even when God gave his covenant to Israel on Mount Sinai, it began with the words, "I am Yahweh, your God, who brought you out of Egypt, out of the land of slavery." That's in Exodus chapter 20, verse 2. Deliverance came first, and solely by God's actions. Israel's response to commands of the law was to follow. Thus, it was with Abraham. The promise was made first, then Abraham responded with obedience, however imperfectly. So, Abraham could boast, but not toward God, that is, not in his relationship with God. Abraham's righteousness before God, then, was not based on works. This is made clear in Genesis 15:6. And he believed the Lord, and he counted it to him as righteousness. You might remember that we talked about that verse when we were reading through the book of Genesis. Here, the Hebrew in the original speaks of an ongoing relationship of faith. Now, Paul expresses it like this in Romans 4:3. For what does the scripture say? Abraham believed God, and it was counted to him as righteousness. Counted or credited comes from a Greek word that normally meant a numerical calculation. Then it became a word used in accounting. It means to place into a person's account. So, this verb doesn't describe Abraham's actions toward God. It describes God doing something for Abraham, and Abraham simply receives it through believing. So, a person's faith is accounted for righteousness before God by God, as it says in chapter 4, verse 5 in Romans. Paul then draws an analogy from the workplace world that we're familiar with even today. Righteousness isn't paid to a person as if it was their paycheck for doing works. It is, on the other hand, credited to their account apart from works. That is, it is a gift received through faith, not even earned by it. And the most remarkable part of these remarkable verses is that God even declares the ungodly righteous. More precisely, righteousness is credited to the one believing on the one who declares the ungodly righteous. This is the kind of God we believe in. Here, you probably can think of the many examples in the Gospel of Luke where Jesus was criticized for associating with sinners, yet where Jesus made a point of demonstrating that sinners have forgiveness, not those who assume that they are righteous based on works. Next, Paul quotes David in Psalm 31 in verses 7 through 8 of chapter 4 of Romans. Blessed are those whose lawless deeds are forgiven, Paul writes, and whose sins are covered. Blessed is the man against whom the Lord will not count his sin. So the faith which is credited for righteousness is the one which believes on the God who declares the ungodly righteous. So in Abraham, we clearly see that works and boasting are excluded. Instead, faith, the opposite of working, passively receives a declared righteousness which is credited to the person by the God who goes so far as to credit the ungodly with righteousness through faith. So God's blessing then comes not as a response to our good works or our boasting or even circumcision, as Paul points out. Neither is it found in one's attempts to keep from sinning or stop sinning for that matter. Instead, as David still says, it rests upon those whose lawless acts were forgiven, whose sins were covered over, and in no way debited against them. The faith of such ungodly people is credited as righteousness in the blessed accounting of God. So, that is a crucial step along the way here in the book of Romans. We'll see that this is further explored, and once again, we'll start talking about the relationship of the law in all of this. But for now, it's good to understand this whole crediting of righteousness as it's portrayed in this section in Romans. May God be with you and bless you, and I'll talk with you again.